The number of sailing rigs used by whaleboats is staggering, but over the years I've used only two. If the boat's going to be displayed with the rig up, I usually make a jib-headed, high-peak gaff rig. It was favored by a good number of whalers in the late 19th and early 20th century. If the boat's going to be displayed with the sail down, I equip it with a more modestly designed gaff rig. And I use the dimensions and the specs from the Beetle Whaleboat that's on display at the Nantucket Whaling Museum. In this episode, I'll concentrate mostly on the spars. The mast has the most detail, and that's really not saying much. At the tabernacle, it's 4 inches in diameter and tapers down to about 2.5 inches at the mast step. It does taper along its length, too, losing about an inch by the time it gets to the upper end. 4 inches down from the top, there's a shoulder cut into the mast that reduces the diameter about 1 5/8 inches, or should I say, to about 1 5/8 inches. The shrouds will sit on this, and there is a pin through the tenon to keep the shrouds from falling off when the boat is downrigged. About 4 inches down from that, there is a through mortise cut in to accommodate a sheave for the throat halyard. Now for this model, I decided to use white holly for the mast. And I start by sizing a blank on the table saw, about 25 thousandths oversized. Remember, wiggle room is our friend. Then, using a small hand plane, I make the square 8-sided. And from there I take it over to the lathe and finish making it round with some files and sanding, starting with a rough cut file and going through a couple of other grades of files and sandpapered from 80 grit down to about 320. Now this is also the time to put that taper in at the end for the mast step and the shoulder at the top. Now, what you see me doing here on the lathe, you don't really need a lathe for. You can do this very easily in a hand drill, and that's the way I did it for years before I bought a lathe. Next, I mark out the through mortise for the throat halyard. And since I don't have a vertical mill, I do this all on the drill press. And I drill a hole of the right diameter at the top and the bottom of those marks that I made for the mortise. Then, I lower the quill down just a bit and start cranking the x-axis, nibbling away at the material between the two holes until I reach the other end. And I just keep doing this until I break through on the underside of the mast. When I like the look of the mortise, I change the drill bit, turn the mast 90 degrees, and drill it for the sheave pin. You can just install the sheave pin and run the halyard over that. Once the throat halyard is rove through the mortise, you can't really see the sheave inside anyhow. I put one on this model just 'cause. Now I've finished all the spars the same way, so I'll just show you the mast here. And if you've seen any of my other videos on painting and weathering, this will seem very familiar, and possibly even boring. But briefly, here it is. The first thing I do is give the spar a coat of shellac as a sealer. I thin it down 1 to 1 with denatured alcohol. This does a couple of things. It raises the grain slightly, so then it can be sanded down nice and smooth, and I've got a nice smooth surface to apply the stain. And when I do apply the stain, it gives me great control over how the color is absorbed into the wood. If I'm not crazy about the way it looks, almost all of it can be wiped off, and I can take another shot at it. Low stress wood finishing. I like that. Staining and weathering is next, and here there's a bit of room for interpretation. Now, whether or not these spars were actually coated with anything or treated in any way, I really don't know, but my instinct is that they were not. There's that Yankee thrift thing again. What can be reasonably assumed is that they were subjected to the same harsh working conditions and abuse as anything else in this trade. So that means they probably only looked new until they were used for the first time. After that, they got old really quickly. And this gives us an opportunity to tell a story with the model. How we apply weathering and color can allow the viewer to delve a bit deeper into what they're seeing. Is that mast a new piece, all bright and yellow? Or is it dark gray around the tabernacle and the foot? Is there rust at the shiv pin? Are there marks where the mast hoops and the jaws have rubbed on that mast? Maybe even wearing a groove in it. What's the color of the rigging? Is it the color of new straw? Or is it gray because it's been out to sea a while? With a subject like the whaleboat, this is just one place where you have the opportunity to take your viewers somewhere or somewhen they never knew they could go. Well, this was brief for me. Anyway. Now the boom and the gaff were both just bamboo poles, usually about 3 inches in diameter at one end, and they tapered down to about 2 or 2.5 inches at the other. It really depends on the piece of bamboo they had in their shop at the time. The boom has a set of iron jaws to fit it around the mast, and these are served, and that serving ends in a toggle and an eye, and that keeps it attached to the mast. About 3/4 of the way to the outboard end, the sheet is attached with an eye splice. Now the gaff has an iron hoop at its mast end, and that's also served. This is where the throat halyard is attached as well, and about 2/3 of the way along its length, the peak halyard is tied on. Now, there's nothing very interesting about making either of these spars. I did, however, make them out of bamboo. I had some skewers in the kitchen that were very close to the size I needed, so I just sanded them down to the right diameter. To look at the finished spars, you really can't tell what they're made from. There's no structural or aesthetic reason for this. Like the shiv in the mast, I did it just 'cause. An interesting note concerning the peak halyard. Now for the rig, I'm using the specifications in Ansell's book on whaleboats at Mystic Seaport, specifically his notes on the beetle boat at the Nantucket Museum. Now in his list of details for the rig, he mentions there is no peak halyard for the gaff, only a throat halyard. He assumes there had to have been one at one time, but must have gotten lost along the boat's long journey in time and space to the museum. Now, since the boat has no peak halyard, it also has no means of running it down to the crew below. There is no detail on the mast to accommodate this, so I'm going to make the very bold assumption that there must have been perhaps a small fair lead of some kind, if not a block. It must have been seized to one of the shrouds. So the halyard would run from the gaff to the fair lead, and from there down to the crew's eager little hands. And you'll see just how that goes in an upcoming episode. Many of you watching will know my material of choice for sail making is silkspan, especially at smaller scales like this, and especially if there's going to be a furled sail. I do, of course, use woven cloth from time to time on larger scale models or for restoration work, especially on pond boats. But for this type of application, silkspan is by far the best, if not the only real choice. Now, if you've never used silkspan, I have a 3-part series on how to deal with the stuff. So I won't go into great detail here. Just look for the little white circle in the upper right corner for a link to take you right to them. Here, I'll just give you the broad strokes. There is one new feature that I'm including on this model that I've always meant to try, but for some reason never did. And that is reducing the size of the sail by about 20 or 30%. I'm trying 20% for this model just to see if it actually is going to work. Now, my main reason for doing this is to reduce bulk and make it easier to create a more realistic look of canvas on spars. Even though you've heard me praising the virtues of silkspan for furled sails, it can be frustrating to try to flake down that sail and roll it tight enough so that it still looks like a sail and not a party joint that could put any self-respecting stoner into a coma. And I've had to field this question a fair bit from you guys out there, so I thought it was time I take my own advice. Now, it's important to remember it's only the height you want to reduce. In the case of a square sail, the head and the foot remain the same width. They still have to fit along the yards. But it's only the leeches that get reduced in height. The same can be said for our gaff sail. It's the leech and the luff are the 2 parts to get reduced. So with that in mind, let's take a sprint through the process. I get out a sheet of silkspan and I cut a piece about twice the size of what I'll need, or what I think I'll need. The reason for this is if I make a mistake along the way, I have enough material left over to take another shot at it. And I won't have to stop, get out the silkspan, cut a piece off, paint it, cut it. Well, you get the idea. And I mean, not that I've ever actually made a mistake anyway. I find that passing a warm iron over the sheet will let it lie flat, and that will help a lot when it comes time to apply the paint. And speaking of paint, mixing color is next. And here, as with the silkspan, if I think I've mixed enough, I double it. And for the same reason. Now, someone left a comment asking how I mix the colors for my sails. And truthfully, I don't have a set way of doing it. It varies from one model to the next. And there are a lot of factors that will influence what I'll do. Will the sail be set or stowed? What's the scale? Is it a small sail or is it a larger sail that's going to have a huge visual impact on the model? And on. You get the idea. But I do have certain colors I go to more often than not. Usually titanium white, ivory black, and raw sienna for a little bit of warmth. And I start by mixing a neutral gray with just the black and white, and I add that to the titanium white. Then, a little at a time, I add raw sienna to get just a bit of warmth. Then, I spray the sheet with just a bit of water, and that helps to keep it in place on the cutting mat. It won't be sliding around on me. And then I can start painting. Now, since this is a furled sail, it isn't necessary to paint both sides. If I were going to set the sail, I would, after the first coat dried, flip it over and give it another coat. But here, the one coat of color is more than enough. And I roll the paint on until I get an even coverage. And if you're using artist's acrylics, it's best to work as quickly as possible. These paints are pretty fast drying, And as the paint starts to dry, the roller will pull the paint up as it passes over the surface. This leaves tiny peaks in the paint, and the closer you get to being dry, the more likely those little peaks will remain on the surface. And this really isn't something you want. So the faster you can get a good even coat on the sheet, the flatter and smoother your finish will be. Now, when the paint looks good, I hang it over the edge of the table to dry, and from this point on, it really pays to work as cleanly as possible. As you see, I'm working on a large cutting mat, and before I go on to the next steps, I take a few minutes to really clean the surface well and make sure there's no debris on the surface. Now that the silkspan has been prepared and is completely dry, I can lay out the sail. A quick hit with the iron takes out any wrinkles from the painting process, and it flattens the sheet out nicely. I trace the sail using the new reduced pattern, and I put in the seam lines with a 5H pencil. Next, I cut a bunch of strips for the tabling, and I prepare to put those on. Now I'm going to be using white glue to attach the tabling. And a word of caution here, do not be over generous with the glue. It will only saturate the silkspan and make it much more likely that the sail will stick to things you don't really want it stuck to. And I use an iron to force dry the glue, and I usually set it to its lowest temperature. Anything between 150 and 200 degrees is good. All will become clear in just a moment. It goes like this. I apply the glue sparingly, and I try to be quick and neat about it. I lay the tabling on the marked edge of the sail and gently tamp it down with a finger. Next, I cover it with a piece of clean parchment paper, and with that warm iron, I make a very light pass. And after this initial pass, I make sure the sail and the tabling aren't glued to anything but each other. If all is well, I can be a bit more deliberate with the ironing. I just have to remember to peel the parchment paper off the sail after every pass. Now, with the tabling all applied to the edges of both sides of the sail, I can cut it free from the sheet and add the corner reinforcements. Because this sail will be furled, and because I know from past experience very little of those corner reinforcements will actually be seen, I don't have to spend a lot of time cutting out radiused shapes and complex patterns here. The reinforcements are there strictly, as their name implies, to reinforce the corners of the sail so it will be able to stand up to being installed on the model. If this were a set sail, all of those details would have been there. And that's the sail complete. In the next episode, we'll take a look at making the line tubs, and we'll assemble the sailing rig and stow it down. And it really is time to start thinking about how the model will be displayed. There are endless options here that could, and likely, will have an effect on how I do certain things from here on out. In the case of this model, no pun intended, there are a few things we know already. It will be displayed with the sail stowed and stashed under the last thwart. And I've gotten into the habit of making the infield of the case look like the deck of a ship or perhaps the floor of the Beetle shop. I think I'll keep that look. It's a bit more environmental than just putting it on an all-wooden base or maybe a painted infield. But will the whalecraft be stowed in the boat, or displayed on the deck, or some combination thereof? Will it be up on sawhorses, or on a keel beam, as it was built in the Beadle shop. A section of whale ship's bulwarks could be built, complete with davits, and the boat could be hung from that. I've never done that one. Don't know if it's too hokey, though. All things to think about. And as a matter of fact, why don't you let me know in the comments section which idea you like? Maybe I'll go with that. So, until next time, remember to treat each other nicely. Now, break's over. Get back in the shop.